from her book, and then I'll read from my book, and then we'll have a conversation and also take some questions from the audience.
Thank you all for coming on this very, very cold day. And thanks to the Writers Workshop for having us. First, before I start reading, I'm gonna just tell you a tiny bit about my book because nobody ever really, I think, understands what it's about. So my book, Free the Land, is about land and how the way that we primarily treat it as a commodity here in the US is tied to a bunch of our problems. It's like helps to drive structural racism, climate and the environmental crisis, the housing crisis. And I think when most people think about land, I think most people think of, natural bucolic places, mountains, forests, that kind of thing. But it's actually so much more, and it grounds everything. It grounds this building beneath us. It grounds like spaceports, the data farms that like house our digital avatars, city parks, recreation centers, like literally everything. And I think today we mostly think about land in terms of real estate, which is just land and housing or land in the buildings, anything we build on top, all of it rolled in together. So we just refer to it now as real estate. And for regular people in the US, real estate is like a safe place for us to park our money, and have some assets that we can use to build some security for retirement, to have a little bit of generational wealth, something to pass on to children. And these things are especially important here in the US, where there's we have anemic social security system or welfare and no economic rights. But the problems begin with the system where if land is a commodity in this free market in land, wealthy people are able to buy property simply as a place, simply as a financial investment. And they can speculate on it in the hopes that its value will grow. And it usually does because there's a finite amount of land on this earth. And yeah, that's where many of these problems begin. There's unequal power relationships, from the kind of relationships between landlords and tenants, where landlords get all the financial benefits of, the rise in land value. They control the space, but the tenants rely on, their apartments for housing, one of basic human rights. It's very a deeply racialized issue, right? Redlining is totally linked to land value. And I mean, when it comes to farmland ownership, the one statistic that I always like to throw out is that 97% of farms, 94% of farm acreage in the US is owned by white farmers. But land has mostly disappeared from political discourse. We talk about capitalism, inequality, wealth, housing, climate, environment, but I think most people, when you hear the word land reform or something, you think that's a developing country or third world sort of issue. But land speculation is it's just a central, recurring theme in our history. George Washington was a land speculator. Our incoming president is a real estate developer. So yeah, that's a little bit of context for what this book about land is really about. So I'm going to read a little abridged part from the introduction of the book. And I'm going to start in northern Alberta, which is the province where Calgary, our hometown, is located. And so this is the heart of this is the home of the Canadian tar sands, which you might remember as the Keystone XL pipeline, That was like the beginning of the climate movement, and that would have brought oil from the tar sands all the way down to Texas. In northern Alberta, the tar sands, a semi-solid kind of oil, are mostly mined from the ground, leaving gaping, barren valleys where boreal forests once thrived. Lakes of wastewater residue dot the land and are apparently so vast and numerous that they can be seen from outer space. Fort McKay, a 500-person hamlet, sits at the heart of these developments and is boxed in on all sides by the developments. Despite being perched on the banks of the Athabasca River, fed by glaciers in the Rocky Mountains, all of the community's drinking water must be trucked in. It's also home to the Fort McKay First Nations, which has grown wealthy over the last 3 decades by providing support services to tar sands corporations through their tribe-owned Fort McKay group of companies. They're known for encouraging further oil development, and many in the energy industry consider them a model First Nations community. I met their then chief, Jim Boucher, in his impeccable corner office in the center of town, lined with windows overlooking the Athabasca River, its waters shimmering in the afternoon light. We swam in there, he recalled. He pointed to a forested hill where he lived as a child, back when there were no roads or electricity. The water was drinkable and everybody lived off the land. At 6 each morning, he paddled with his grandfather to the Muskeg River, a tributary of the Athabasca, where their fishnet hung heavy with the day's catch. Then they canoed back to the hill with their haul. Boucher's job was to carry the load from the river, then up to the slope to where they grew cabbage, potatoes, and carrots. He's the last generation of his family to grow up in this way. Surveyors had begun appearing in the 1950s, running seismic lines and drilling holes to measure how much oil was beneath. But the development didn't arrive until 1963, when Boucher was 12 years old. One day, he left his grandfather's cabin to check the squirrel, mink, and weasel snares he had set the previous day. And I came across a big freaking clearing where all of my snares were, he told me. He found men operating heavy machinery. My grandfather wasn't told that was going to happen. Needless to say, Boucher lost all the snares, and soon after that, they bulldozed his grandfather's cabin too. That clearing is part of the Syncrude oil site today. They just went ahead and did it. It was simply how business was carried out back then. The government and companies struck a deal between themselves, he said, and the people were left on the sidelines. They weren't consulted. And the government certainly didn't ask how the development would impact his people. We lost an important area for food and harvesting. People started noticing changes. Something was wrong with the fish, which tasted of oil. The snow they melted in wintertime for drinking water was covered in soot. River water made people sick. The Cree nations spoke out about the destruction, but were ignored. Boucher grew into Fort McKay's outspoken young radical sent to represent the tribe at regulatory hearings and castigate the government and energy industry for wantonly destroying his community's livelihood and health without even compensation for the damage. Essentially, I was the big mouth at Fort McKay, chuckled. When no one registered opposition to new projects on tribal land, Boucher helped set up road blockades to force the energy industry to negotiate. I was pissed off. Still, it wasn't until the mid-1980s that life definitively changed in Fort McKay. Although 2 decades of oil development had polluted the ecosystem, making it impossible to live entirely off the land, the community had at least been able to rely on trapping to make a comfortable living. Then animal rights activists in Europe succeeded in marginalizing the fur trade. Fort McKay found itself with no choice but to cooperate with the energy industry. In 1985, the tribe founded the Fort McKay group of companies. We fought for a long time to preserve our way of life, Boucher told me. We had a lot of discussion in our community about what our future was, and a lot of people were involved. We knew that our way of life was under threat. And then I'm going to fast forward a little bit and skip ahead to later in my introduction. I remember when, around 2018, I noticed a heated driveway a block away from my childhood home. It was a few days before Christmas, and the entire city was shrouded in snow, but this driveway, emanating from a freshly constructed miniature castle, was an exception. Snowflakes fluttered in an airborne ballet, then vaporized the instant they hit the ground. Not a streak of white was visible on the pristine gray stones. Calgary, Alberta is a wintry prairie city where shoveling the driveway is a rite of passage and was my favorite household chore growing up. More recently, it was also Canada's richest city for a brief few years, thanks to the tar sands boom that transformed the former ranching town into the oil capital of Canada. The driveway was practically a symbol of this transformation. The property was purchased by the director and chairman of a Koch brothers oil and gas pipeline company for $2.5 million in 2013. That's more than a dozen times what my parents paid for our house in 1990. This reflected a broader neighborhood trend. In the last decade, nearly all of the houses surrounding the heated driveway in our formerly middle-class suburb were demolished and resurrected as McMansions or sleek, angular, contemporary homes. I mentioned the driveway to my dad. Never have to shovel again? He pondered. Then a cackle. Great. I imagine my dad arriving in Calgary in 1976, stoic, easygoing, and enterprising like he is today, and comparing his frigid new life to the tropical Malaysian climate of his youth. It was like going from heaven to hell, he recalls. He had just been denied a green card from the United States and was forced to leave San Francisco, his home for a few brief years, in what he still thinks of as the low point of his life. But US immigration had made its decision. One of his friends, another Malaysian Chinese from engineering school, was already living in Calgary and told him that the jobs were abundant, well paid, and would my dad like to come crash on his couch for as long as he wanted? Sure, why not? This tiny snowball of a nowhere city, as Calgary seemed to him at the time, offered little by way of San Francisco's vibrant cosmopolitanism. But he went and he stayed, buoyed by the wisdom of his friends. There are 500,000 people who live there. Why can't you? And the city did not disappoint. He began exploring the clear, winding rivers, thick old forests, and cobalt glacier lakes nearby. He learned to ski in the austere peaks of the Rocky Mountains, forever a spectral band along Calgary's western horizon. Finally, armed with a chemical engineering degree, he also found a job. It was 9 years after the first commercial tar sands operation began, and Syncrude, then a research consortium of oil companies, hired him. 2 years later, Syncrude finally finished constructing their mine, right where the young Jim Boucher, later the chief of the Fort McKay First Nations, had laid his traps in the forest, where his grandfather's trapping cabin once stood. It was just 45 minutes from Fort McMurray, the boom town at the center of the oil sands operation, and my dad began commuting there, 730 kilometers north of Calgary, for 4-day stretches at a time. He worked 12-hour shifts before falling asleep each day, exhausted, in the company barracks. He still frowns at the memory of the commute, the same frown that he reserves for his memories of his first Canadian winter. But at least there was a silver lining, he jokes. The buffet-style cafeteria served unlimited steak. The region's growth always included Chinese workers and foreign migrants who arrived after building the Canadian Pacific Railroad and mining for gold on the coast. But it was after Imperial Oil struck oil in 1947 in the Duke, a massive oil reserve in central Alberta, that the population ballooned, and with it, the immigrant population. And despite the roller coaster of euphoric booms and catastrophic recessions that's typical of oil regions, new immigrants continue to arrive, making it the fastest growing city in Canada, especially young and increasingly diverse. Despite its honky-tonk cowtown image in the cultural capitals out east, it's also a progressive city in a staunchly conservative province. In 2010, as police departments in the US were imposing dragnet surveillance on Muslim communities, Calgary elected a young, Twitter-savvy man to become the first Muslim mayor of a North American city. This liberal vision was not what motivated my father to move to Calgary in 1976, but on a recent drive through the Rockies for a family hike, I realized from one of my mother's throwaway comments that it is why they have stayed. "This is a good place," she remarked to no one in particular as we passed a government-run lodge where rooms and cabins are cheap, luxurious, and reserved for seniors and people with disabilities. I thought at first that she meant the lodge, the endless forest, the flock of wild sheep that we had just encountered, and the sunny skies. But when I asked, she clarified that she meant society's willingness to take care of its most vulnerable residents. And yet, there is something about those southern Alberta skies, because of the flatness of the city and the prairies, and the region's perpetual sunniness, the sky here is exaggeratedly big. On other occasions, my mother, a painter with an eye for the ever-changing natural light, has also perplexed me with throwaway remarks about the enigmatic sky. Does she mean that bluish dome above? I asked, and she clarified, yes, but she also meant that having grown up here, my life has been enriched by far greater opportunities than her. I have heard similar words from immigrant workers in Fort McMurray, a town that's often maligned for its man camp culture of drugs and strip clubs, but is also home to a rainbow population of immigrant caregivers, janitors, taxi drivers, grocers, fast food workers, and entrepreneurs. I've only ever visited Fort McMurray for reporting trips and water protector gatherings, but it was there that I was finally able to picture, through the lives of other immigrants, what life might have been like for my dad in his first years in Canada. Driving past the strip malls and fast food joints along Main Street, I imagined him as a young man with feathered hair, vinyl slacks, and aviator sunglasses in this alien place. Today, Friday prayers at the town mosque overflow to such an extent that additional prayers are held at a nearby gym. Large communities hail from India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Venezuela. The North African cab driver, Jamaican Burger King clerk, and Filipina cashier at the Asian grocery all sung praises to me of Fort McMurray's small town community spirit and inclusiveness. But one person I spoke to in particular many years ago made me think of my dad. Maybe it was because Larson Rivera, Filipino, long-haired and baby-cheeked, even in his mid-30s, is also Southeast Asian and shared his outgoing, unflappable, easygoing nature, his ability to enjoy the unlimited steak in less optimal scenarios. Also, he grimaced in a similar way at the memory of his first northern winter. Otherwise, their career paths couldn't be more different. I met him in early 2015 at the local Subway franchise, where he began his Canadian life as a fledgling sandwich artist on a temporary foreign worker visa before rising to produce manager at Sobeys Grocery and a permanent Canadian resident. He was practically an elder among the Filipino subway workers of Fort McMurray, his shared house of Filipino immigrants also functioning as a free crash pad for the chain's newest Filipino staff, a safety net as they transitioned to Northern Canadian life. We started that way at zero, so we're just paying back, he explained. But Rivera knew that the oil economy needed them too, and he scoffed at the ignorant Facebook rants he had seen about foreign workers stealing local jobs. If there were no foreign workers here, no one would actually be serving you coffee at Tim Hortons, and no one would actually be making you sandwiches at Subway, he guffawed. And there was little doubt in his mind that Subway and Sobeys were better than his old jobs at Blockbuster in the Philippines and Le Pain Quotidien in Kuwait. Despite his university degree and academic scholarships, there was little opportunity for upward mobility in the Philippines, while Kuwait offers no path to citizenship for most immigrants. By contrast, Fort McMurray turned out to be the proverbial land of opportunity. It also turned out that way for my dad. That is because after Syncrude, he worked for decades at Imperial Oil, ExxonMobil, basically, in what economists would call a good job, relatively stable, well-paid, with great benefits, a decent commute, room for personal growth, and reasonable working hours. Every few years, trailing the whiplash boom-bust cycles of oil prices, he still found himself white-knuckled amid another tsunami of mass layoffs, watching colleagues smarter than him being let go day by day, and always wondering if he was next. But his time never came. And after a decade, he was able to buy a house in an old middle-class neighborhood where housing prices would drastically appreciate, and many, many years later, the new neighbors would install a heated driveway. Immigration restrictions once barred him from the American dream, but he achieved what he now sees as even better, the Canadian dream, or maybe the Albertan dream, built by immigrants who constructed railways, mined profits for resource companies, laundered clothing, and served food in Calgary's extensive network of suburban Chinese restaurants. In Fort McMurray, immigrants still keep bloodstreams caffeinated, care for the children of other working parents, and engineer new methods of oil extraction. Often, it is in pursuit of this same dream where a good middle-class life is actually possible thanks to a reasonably well-funded, well-maintained system of basic services, infrastructure, and amenities. I attended excellent public schools while my father's good job paid for piano lessons and soccer or hockey league fees. Not far from our home was a comfortable, well-stocked public library and a sprawling, well-kept provincial park that's also shared by deer, coyotes, owls, and herons. And there are also those mountains, those sublime symbols of an untouched wilderness, and the rolling foothills that have often appeared as stand-ins for the American West in Hollywood epics, The Revenant, Brokeback Mountain. Even the roads and trails that make the Rockies easily accessible for recreation year-round are maintained in part by oil profits, either through corporate sponsorship or royalty revenues and public funding. That's all I'll read.
Nope. Want it like that, or do we want it like that? A little light? Is that good enough? Okay, cool.
So I'm going to read from this book I wrote, Property Journal, which was published just a few months ago. And it basically is what the title is. It's a journal about property. I'm going to read the dedication and the introduction and the first month, basically. And I'll just wait for the projector to turn on because I'm going to show you the pages as I read. Warming up, right? In many ways, the book, like Audrea's book, is about so-called Canada, and most of the journal takes place in Toronto, where I usually live. So the dedication is to everyone fighting against poverty. I started this property journal at the end of 2021 and kept it for 13 months until the end of 2022. The idea was to write down all of the instances where real estate, property, and housing came up in conversation. To maintain some anonymity, I've changed the names of friends, family, and others to those of household objects. Part of the compulsion to start this journal came from how I identify with being a, quote, productive person. I've always wanted to have a daily writing practice, but never managed to keep one. Many of the verbs that are used to describe actions in relation to time, like waste, carve, kill, can also be used with property. I've heard that you shouldn't bring up real estate in conversation because then you'll get stuck talking about it. The conversation will get stuck. So this is December 2021, 1st of December. The Uber driver complained to me, it's too expensive living in Toronto. The houses are too expensive here. You can't buy anything. My friend bought a house near Barrie. It was $200,000 and now it's worth $800,000. If you want to buy anything, you have to buy outside of Toronto. 2nd December, Saucer and Muffin Tin said they woke up early one morning to pieces of their apartment complex's roof flying past their window and contractors yelling "wee" and "woo" from above as they tore the roof apart. They threw pieces of it everywhere, covering their doorway, the plants in the garden, everything. Their landlord hadn't given anyone in the apartment complex any notice. Piles of black roofing material blocked the stairs so they couldn't leave, and one of their neighbors' windows was smashed by the flying debris. The residents complained, and then the following week, the same contractors came back and completed the exact same job without making a huge mess. 3rd December. Talked to my sister, Lender, who's pregnant for the first time, about the new house that she and her partner, Ma, bought a few months ago. They're renovating the house so that they can live in it with her parents. It's a 3-story house with 4 bedrooms on the top floor. Originally, they'd looked for a house with a separate suite for mom and dad to live in, but they couldn't find anything within their price range. So now the plan is for everyone to move in together with the new baby. Everyone is nervous about this plan and the potential for conflict. I have no idea how they'll all get along with everyone's big tempers, but I do know that my sister is devoted to my parents and really wants them in Toronto with us. She said it's costing many times the original estimate because of pandemic inflation, amounts of money that are unimaginable to me. Her friend, Teapot, who's also their real estate agent, bought a new house that he's renovating as well. The contractor doing his house is cheaper than my sister's, cash only, but Teapot also has to do a lot of the project managing. He also supports his brothers and sisters. 4th December. I read about a 98-year-old billionaire named Charles Munger, who donated $200 million towards the construction of a new student residence at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with the stipulation that he designs the building. He doesn't have any architecture training. He's a finance guy who works with Warren Buffett. He calls himself an amateur architect. The building will be named Munger Hall and will have, of course, 11 stories, housing 4,500 students. 94% of the rooms won't have windows to the outside. Instead, there'll be light fixtures in the style of cruise ship windows. All 9 levels, wait, that's a contradiction. All 11 levels feature identical floor plans so that it'll be cheaper to build, and there are only 2 entrances. One of the architects on the university's review committee, Dennis McFadden, quit, saying that it was inhumane and that the review committee has no actual input because the design is tied to the donation. He said, as the quote, vision of a single donor, the building is a social and psychological experiment with an unknown impact on undergraduates. In response, Munger called all of his critics idiots, saying that his building fixes Le Corbusier's errors and that the prefab concrete will last longer than the pyramids. He said every other college will be jealous. 5th December. At Dim Sum, the gallery director's partner showed Sofa a property listing on his phone for her opinion. They're looking for something to buy. I didn't get to see it. 6th December, there was no entry. 7th December, no entry. 8th December, I went to the showroom for the condo building that's being built across the street from the gallery, walked through the show suite and thought it was nicely laid out, surprisingly. I felt a weird sense of desire toward the condo showroom and wondered, is this desire mine or has it been implanted? It felt a bit like walking through a doll's house and imagining yourself as a doll. On the floor plans, there were asterisks beside some of the suites, and at the bottom, in small print, the footnote said, future-friendly suite. I asked the salesperson what it meant, and she said, It means that it's wheelchair accessible, as in, quote, friendly for aging, a telling euphemism for disability to acknowledge its possibility in the future while excluding it from the present. 9th December, there's no entry. 10th December. While looking at houses for sale in a neighborhood that they liked, Paperclip and J-Cloth saw a huge truck speed through, flying a big flag with a black star, the outline of an AK-47, and the words, "Come and take it." They explained to me that it's a gun rights activist flag and that the phrase is a threat. 11th December, watched Beetlejuice. The movie is essentially about an artist, the mom, who works with a real estate developer, the dad, to gentrify a haunted house. The ghosts are fighting their eviction. Spoon and Jacuzzi have a shockingly affordable, really nice apartment on the top floor of a building in West End, Vancouver. It's older, so it's huge, and you can see the ocean. Earlier in the day, Soap Dish had raved about it to me. You won't believe it. And when I got there, I too spent a good 10 to 15 minutes raving about how I couldn't believe it. 12th December, there's no entry. 13th December, went on a walking tour of Vancouver's Chinatown, and the guide took me to see the remnants of a mural. Someone had spent $30,000 on a beautiful new mural, but then a condo went up right beside it, blocking all but a tiny vertical strip of it, 1 or 2 feet wide, like a ribbon. A portion of the old mural was replicated on the new building by a different artist, but it doesn't really match the ribbon of the original. 14th December, no entry. 15th December, no entry. 16th December, Washcloth described an affordable artist housing project in Vancouver where people on fixed incomes can't apply, i.e. anyone on disability benefits. So you need a job to be eligible or the prospect of a growing income. It seems like applying for a mortgage, the opposite of affordable housing. 17th December, house prices in Victoria, BC are as unhinged as in Toronto, my sister texted. She was just in Victoria, famously a boomer retirement town, visiting friends. Victoria is like this Anglophiliac city on the west coast of Canada where everyone really likes afternoon tea and stuff. 18th December, no entry. 19th December. Mop is trying to get his mom out of the house she shares with his dad because it's becoming impossible for her to live in it. There's stuff everywhere to the point where it's hard to walk around, and she can't cook anymore because his dad's hoarding has entered the kitchen. Mop's dad spends all of his money on collecting stuff, mostly tools and machinery. He doesn't share any of his salary with her. She provided for all of their children with only the income from her low-wage job, and she even paid for half of the house, so she technically co-owns it, but it's barely habitable. 20th December. My parents showed me the spot they bought for themselves at the cemetery. It's kind of an outdoor mausoleum, and they have a shelf to store their ashes. 21st December. I saw an ad on TV offering a quote reverse mortgage for retired people. 22nd December, 23rd December, 24th December, there are no entries. 25th December. In Calgary over Christmas break, and I've been sorting and throwing out my childhood things at my parents' house, toys, clothing, everything in preparation for their move. My mom's amazing. She never throws anything out. She's kept almost everything from my and my sister's childhoods. Every report card, birthday card, my school uniform from kindergarten in Hong Kong, so many cute school projects. One of the best things I found was a newspaper my grade 6 class made with articles about our future selves. My contribution was a megalomaniacal piece about Amy Lam starting and leading a world feminist organization and persuading the Queen of England to cede all crown land to her. It's true. I have a picture of this. My mom saved all her clothing, so I also picked up 20 plus pairs of really nice 90s pants from her, half for me and half for my partner, rice cooker. Most of my current clothing comes from my mom's old wardrobe. It's funny how she's still holding some of her stuff back, even if it doesn't fit her. She says she's not ready to let go of it yet. I had to really convince her to give me the pants, and she still has 5 closets full of clothing, mostly from winters, spread across the 3 floors of the house. One of the most bittersweet parts was going through the CD collection and trying to make Dad's old stereo system work again. I have so many memories of listening to his CDs on stereo of his love of music. My dad used to have a subscription to Columbia Club where he would get CDs in the mail, and it was always so fun to look at them. I remember being so confused and obsessed by the Jethro Tull album Thick as a Brick. I had a fake newspaper for the album art with all these fake articles that I read so intently. What did it all mean? I still don't know what it means. This might have been around the time of the grade 6 newspaper from the future. Glenda and I sorted through all the family pics, gifts, and special objects that sit on the shelves in the family room above the fireplace/TV. That's supposedly where all the precious stuff goes, like Grandpa's crystal Lalique bowl, but it was also full of random stuff my mom had just shoved in there, like crappy souvenirs given to her by relatives. Blender kept saying, "There won't be room for this in the new house." We had to throw out Mom's old dried flower arrangements and wreaths. Everything was so dusty. 26th December. I saw my old friend Airplane, aka Audrea, from high school. Airplane isn't even a household object. We talked about the impossibility of ever buying anything anywhere, and about my parents retiring this year but not being able to afford a home in Toronto. Her friend, who maybe is in this room, bought a cabin in upstate New York for $180,000. It's a very small 1-bedroom, and the pipes aren't insulated for winter. We also covered the classic topic of how in Montreal, it's still cheaper, but it's changed a lot. Airplane pays $1,800 in New York for a 1-bedroom. 27th December. I watched a TikTok about the countries where house prices have risen the most. It showed a bar graph with the bars just rising and rising and rising. And the one that basically shot off the graph was Canada. The soundtrack was the theme song from Squid Game. The other day, I explained Squid Game to my dad. It's a Korean TV series about a super violent game show where all the contestants have insurmountable debts, and if they aren't killed, they can win a huge amount of money. His eyes opened super wide. Really? And I realized he thought I was describing a real reality show where people were actually killed for trying to eliminate their debt. 28th December, there's no entry. 29th December. I complained to rice cooker. It's fucked up that my parents who work their whole lives, sometimes 2 jobs, and still can't afford to buy their own house in Toronto, which is just another city in Canada where their kids live. Not that everyone needs to own a house, but in the absence of other forms of security, what else is there? Rice cooker got a response from one of the hundreds of apartment co-op applications he sent out earlier this year on our behalf. We're not sure yet if I'll move to Montreal or if he'll move to Toronto, but he thought we should see if we could get into one of the co-op buildings because that might tip the balance. There are way more co-ops in Montreal than Toronto. The system is still supported by the provincial government in some way, and there's a lot of variety in terms of building and location. And the prices, very humane. Rice cooker spent weeks compiling a big list of all the co-ops, writing letters and mailing them off, and now one has written back. 30th December, there's no entry. 31st December. I talked to Rice Cooker about how Frying Pan owned a house because he inherited some money before the market went bonkers, and how I was frustrated because I felt like he didn't understand or fully acknowledge the privilege of his position, and this was part of what ended our relationship for me. But during our relationship, I lived in his house basically for free, and he was always so giving and generous to me. Maybe the most difficult thing was this tension within myself between how I lived and what I thought was, quote, right. January 2022. From the 1st to 9th of January, there are no entries. 10th January. I took some time off and forgot or was too tired to write things down in this journal, and now I can't remember them. I'm sure there's lots of things I missed. And that's all I'm going to read.
Feel very privileged that I got to be an airplane, which is not a household item. I'm sure it was just a mistake, but I'm like, maybe it's because I have I don't know,
can leave it down.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I mentioned.
a high flying, daring personality.
Yes.
Yes.
That is the real meaning, yes.
Yeah, so the first time that I read your book, I was like, wow, this form is just brilliant. It kind of actually made me want to like start keeping a journal about just some topic. But it was really amazing to see how like the drama of your life and the story of like your parents' retirement and like grappling with them moving in with your sister, like trying to deal with the old house, and how all of that is like contextualized by all the changes that you're seeing in the city, all the things you're reading about with real estate. And yeah, like it made me realize that just like so much of the drama, the mundane drama of like daily existence is actually like shaped by real estate. And we never think about it in those terms. So like, how did you even come up with this? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, well, the kind of impetus was that I was working towards an exhibition, and maybe we can show some of the pictures in the slide, thank you. And the gallery that I was working with was located in Richmond in BC, which is like this very Chinese suburb. And it was located right across from this giant like condo development. And that's what I talk about in one of the entries that I just read, going to see this condo showroom. And this was also the year that my parents were just starting to talk about like moving out of their house and, and retiring. And my sister was like doing all this stuff with her own life and buying properties and renovating houses and stuff. So that was the context, like not only for the gallery, but also in my own life. And I thought, well, I'll start keeping this journal, but I didn't necessarily think it was going to be a book. I thought that it would be some kind of like installation or something that people could look at, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to read like all the entries. I thought it'd be more like a visual thing in some ways. And then, so yeah, if you move forward, Mohammed, in the slide deck, you can get to the calendar. We can just wait for it to warm up. Yeah. So in the exhibition, it was formatted as this calendar, which was like a 1 page a day calendar. And then if you go to the next picture, every day in the exhibition, the gallery docents would like rip off a page and throw it on the floor. And then people entering would read like 10 different entries, but they never really had the chance to read the whole thing. And yeah, and so when I kind of was like, okay, now I'm going to make it into a book, that became like a whole other process. And yeah, it was just like kind of a struggle in a way to make it into like a book versus this kind of thing, which felt much more like private and safe for me because not everyone could read everything, and then now it's in this book form and I'm like, fuck. Yeah. But yeah, that was basically the process. And maybe the last thing I'll say is just that in the summer of 2021 in Toronto, what was happening was that all these encampments had started up in the city of unhoused people. And because it was COVID and because the shelters were being closed and people had set up tents and stuff. And then the reaction from the city and from the state and from the cops was super violent. And I ended up at this protest where unhoused people and their allies were like defending their homes, and then the cops came in and just like smashed everyone like in the head and like tore up all these people's tents and threw them all away. And it was like they spent millions and millions of dollars that summer, the city of Toronto, in shutting down these encampments. And some of my friends, like my closest friends, were really involved in organizing around that. So that was like this kind of context that I was thinking about as I started keeping the journal. Yeah. But maybe I can ask, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I I think, yeah, I'm curious to hear too, like how, I think what you read from your introduction of like this moment of meeting Jim Boucher and the site that he was formerly trapping at, and that being like the site of Syncrude where your dad worked, and then your dad's history and like you growing up in Calgary. I was thinking about that, how this idea of families or how like the site of family and its relation to land and to property is something that's like common between both of our books. But of course your book goes to numerous other places and like looks at all these different examples of people dealing with land and property in ways kind of beyond the capitalist model. But I guess I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how the book started for you and then the process of working on it and how you kind of came to maybe like the thesis of the book in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stories in the book and my like thinking that went into the book goes back, yeah, like 10 years ago to, you know, the passage that I read. This was like around the time when there was like a lot of organizing around, you know, the Keystone XL pipeline, and the climate movement was sort of just taking off, and I had started to go up to the, as a reporter, a journalist, going up to the Canadian tar sands to report on like the climate movement, which at the time, a lot of the discourse was about like, how many degrees of temperature change would we get from, you know, releasing so much, this number of like carbon emissions into the air. It was like very, very wonky and data driven. So I went there and I was like going to the tar sands healing walk and just spending time around this sort of like water protector movement there. And I realized that, oh, actually for these like activists and just people who are at the center of this movement, climate change is obviously a concern, but that was like not primarily what this movement was about. It was, you know, these were like people from different indigenous nations in the area who had had, you know, their land stolen from them. Their nations still had treaty rights to the land that these oil developments were now like violating. The oil developments were being like driven by fossil fuel companies and governments also seeking oil profits, so like Alberta, Canada, the US government also. But, you know, the developments also threatened like indigenous cultural lifeways and practices that are tied to the land, hunting, gathering, just a relationship to the land, a particular kind of relationship to the land. So I still live in New York now, and at the time I was living in the same apartment that I live in today in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and 10 years ago, like the gentrification, anti-gentrification movement was also like really popping off. And the loudest part of that narrative was definitely about, it was, you know, gentrification is like white people moving into poor Black and brown neighborhoods and like bringing in their matcha oat milk latte cafes and like $25 artisanal cocktails. But within the movement, I was hearing the way that activists explained it was a little bit different. It was that it was a more complex story about how like longtime residents were being either evicted or displaced by like rising rents. And this was a process that they, you know, have no control over. And they were also being ignored when they sort of raised concern about a lot of the things that were like happening in their neighborhood, and they had very little power or like leverage over like a luxury development that was happening like 3 blocks away or whatever. So gentrification is obviously not the same as indigenous dispossession. But what I realized through this, just like going between Calgary and the tar sands and like living here, was that there's something very similar between these movements, which is that they were both about how people are deprived of ownership and control over lands that they use and depend upon. And I realized that issues over land, like who owns it, who controls it, who gets to benefit from it, who gets to decide how it's used, these are questions that are like at the center of the biggest, all of the biggest social issues of our day. And, you know, our political and legal system, economic system, prioritizes the rights and desires of just people who can pay more for land and its resources than everybody else. So that's when I sort of started thinking about the issue. So I think the book probably started coming together many years after that, as I was like kind of trying to just understand more about the issue. And I realized that the people who had thought about this the most, this should not have come as a surprise, but people who thought about this the most, communities and people who were like kind of experimenting with or practicing different ways of owning or stewarding land, or managing land, were people for whom this sort of like private, commodified, the free market in land was not benefiting them. It was like really not working out for them. So most of these are like poor, Black, brown, marginalized communities. So I started just talking to a bunch of people and reporting from a lot of these different places. So the book has like stories of communities who were like poor communities in Boston who, you know, control like much of the 60-acre area of, you know, one of the suburbs, or like a massive, like once informal settlement in San Juan in Puerto Rico. And I realized that there are all these other ways that like we think of, I think private property, private land ownership is like kind of the default way that I thought about how a person owns land, I guess, or before this, I really never thought that much about like, what are different ways that people do this? And I realized that there are just so many other ways actually that people have thought about this. So that's kind of how it all started to come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the parts of the book is you talk about different within the North American context, different ways that Indigenous people have related to land, and then you talk about how the system of private property is really the exception in terms of, or like the current system is the exception in terms of like people thinking that they can own land in perpetuity and without conditions. So like owning it forever until I sell it, or, you know, until my child, I guess, sells it or something, and then without conditions, in the sense that I can do whatever the fuck I want to it. Like even if I destroy it, it's still mine. Whereas in other systems, like in terms of Indigenous governance, that's not the case. Like if you destroy the land, then other people are going to say, well, you can't have it anymore, you know, because it doesn't actually belong to anyone in the sense of like this total ownership. And I think that speaks to like what, you know, yeah, just this idea that the system of property that we live within, like this capitalist system, really is about like severing relationships and like severing relationships between people, between our environments, and like, yeah, and I think that's also what, yeah, happens in my book a lot in terms of like anecdotes of people totally destroying their friendships and like relationships over apartments and stuff like that.
Yeah, like one thing that I had never really understood about property before I was writing this book is that property is a relationship. It's fundamentally relational. It's about there are rules that govern our relationships with each other. And they, you know, the fact that like whatever form that a society prioritizes, that's a reflection of what that society is and the relationships that we have within it. So yeah, in like our society, private property, the relationship is like, if I own a thing, whether it's like a car or a Birkin bag or a house or a piece of land, that means that I kind of have exclusive right over it, and I get to be essentially the dictator of it, you know?
My Birkin bag.
Yeah. And yeah, like a public property, like a national park or whatever, that belongs to the federal government. So we have to like abide by their rules, obviously, if we want to go visit like the Grand Canyon National Park or whatever. But we do ostensibly, like in America, ostensibly it is as a democracy, we are supposed to have some say over it, you know, like through our votes. And you know, that might be like a dysfunctional, that is a very dysfunctional system, obviously, but compare that to like the private property model where we have absolutely no say. We have no you know, over like what our neighbor does on their land. And if they choose to listen to us, that is like out of the goodness of their own heart and not because like there's any institutional, you know, set of practices or rules governing that. So I guess like in a nutshell, it like the emergence of like the kind of commodified private property that we have now, it emerged after like European feudalism, which under that system, the only person who owned the land, and they owned all the land, was the sovereign, like the king or the queen, who owned like all of North America, you know, even though they were in England.
They didn't own it.
Yeah, but you know, they like drafted a charter saying that they owned it, that kind of thing. And then they would like grant some rights to a baron in exchange for the baron maintaining, you know, a standing army for the king. And then the baron would like grant lesser rights to knights and tenant farmers who would then grant even lesser rights to peasants who made up like the vast majority of the population. And so there was just like this overlapping set of land rights. And nobody really like owned the land in any like exclusive sort of way. So it was really with like the rise of modern like capitalism and the Industrial Revolution and wool prices going up that these barons started enclosing the commons. Like you probably heard of the enclosure of the commons. So they started erecting these like ditches or hedges, stone walls to sort of like fence off their sheep. And this had the effect of the commons were a place that, you know, peasants could all go and, you know, they would steward, but they would also, they were free to like fish or gather firewood or, you know, bring their, I don't know, pigs to forage or whatever it was that they did. And now they were just closed out of the space. So that was kind of, you know, the rise of the enclosure movement. But private property in the way that we have it is like very much an American invention. It was, you know, Thomas Jefferson, when he was thinking about what America should be, I mean, he envisioned this as like a nation of yeomen, small yeoman farmers, each with their own little, you know, postage stamp of land to farm. And he thought of small farmers as like the ideal, white small farmers, of course, but as like the ideal citizen. And having ownership over this like little plot of land would make them independent, hardworking, thrifty, and free thinking, allow them to be like free thinking, democratic citizens. I don't know how he got there. Yeah. Well, he got there because the alternative at the time was feudalism. So you're like,
Right.
okay, I mean, compared to feudalism, it's just a little bit better, right? In his defense, I guess. But yeah, so like as America was being becoming a nation, like in the late 1700s, like under Jefferson's stewardship, you know, America like carved up like billions of acres of land, like public domain land, into a grid. And then it sort of like he created a registry of property deeds, forgot the word for a sec, so that it would be easy to like figure out who owned a land and like figure out, you know, land transactions. They create like set prices and public auctions for these public domain lands so that there's some like transparency in the process. And it just created this sort of like seamless market and sort of consolidated what was kind of just a, you know, very like casual, like backdoor, you got to know the right person kind of scenario. It created this like national land market. And you know, Canada was much later to adopt this. They didn't like see the importance of this. And so that's partially why, like kind of early on, a lot of the like English settlers, like immigrants like just started moving south. It wasn't just because of the bad weather. They came because it was like it was really easy to get land in America because America had created this system for it. So it's even though we think of it as like the default today, it's such like a blip and anomaly in history, actually.
Yeah, maybe now is a good time to show my my grade 6 newspaper article that I wrote about myself in the future. If you can go backwards, yeah.
It's so amazing how these like ideas of you writing to the queen, just your grandiose ideas are like exactly about colonialism. Empire as like a 6th grader.
I was
like,
Thomas
that is-
Jefferson, basically.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just read it because it says that this newspaper is from 2015. So I think I wrote it in 1995 probably. And the one that I wrote is on the left-hand side. Women's rights group takes over continent of Europe. The World Women's Rights Group has currently taken over Europe. The vivacious group leader, 31-year-old Amy Lam, gathered females from all over the world to participate in a march to the Parliament buildings in London, England. Lam spoke to the Queen herself. Her Majesty allowed Lam to take control of England and all British government properties. However, Lam had to swear on the Bible that no corruption would occur and absolutely no violence would occur. And this is me as a liberal. The other countries of Europe, having heard of this act, promptly agreed to hand control over to women, but only under the exact circumstances. We asked a male passerby what he thought, and he replied by saying, well, it was bound to happen sooner or later. However, not everybody had the same views. One male said some things that just cannot be printed into a newspaper. We asked Lam for a quote, and she said, this could not have happened without the influence of my family and my best friend, Tanya Brooks. Of course, I credit all the women on earth too. I first started to get hyped about women's rights in grade 6. The boys always thought they were the best, but I made a promise to myself to show them up. And now I have. Remember, females, we rule. How true.
God, this is amazing. This is like kind of an amazing document because I can imagine that you were like completely earnestly thinking that this was like your vision of egalitarianism and feminism, totally earnestly.
I have no memory of writing
grader.
this. Like I have zero memory of it, and I don't think I ever thought about it ever again. So I'm confused why I'm so convinced about it.
But it's like the default. I mean, that is the queen controlling all the crown lands, and that's how everything runs. And the default just is like the frame that all of our dreams or imagination just live in forever unless we change it. You know? But
it'll appeal to the queen.
Yeah. Yeah. So you I kind of want to talk a little bit about like the community land trust, because that was you had started, I think at the time when we had started talking about it, you were not considering this model. And we both kind of like somehow wound up thinking a lot about this model. By the way, a community land trust is, do you want to explain it?
You explain it.
I mean, it's basically a different system of land ownership where instead of having like an individual owning the land, a community owns the land. And this is basically like a nonprofit is the land owner, but this nonprofit, the board is like consists of community members. So it might consist of people who end up having homes on that land or not, just other people in the area local businesses, whatever. So they get to make the decisions about what happens on the land. So it democratizes control over the land to an entire community. At the same time, it allows people, homeowners, to privately own a home on top of the land or a business, or to build, you know, have like a community center or whatever. It allows like individuals to, you know, still accrue like some wealth, but just not, they can still sell or have their children inherit the property, but you just like can't make a windfall on it because like the land itself never goes up for sale. So it's this model that in the US was like pioneered by Black farmers, civil rights activists in the 60s in Southwest Georgia as a way of just like building political and economic power on the basis of like community held land. It's mostly associated today with housing, as it's like thought of as an affordable housing model. Probably the most famous or like the one that people reference most is the one that Bernie Sanders helped to usher into existence in the 80s when he was mayor of Burlington. It's called the Champlain Housing Trust, and they have like a few hundred houses like scattered around the city. But it's this model that actually allows a community to just build what they can build whatever they want in it. I can talk a little bit more about like one of the examples that I mentioned in my book, but I want to talk here about your like how it entered yeah, the sort of like Chinatown activism that you were doing in Toronto.
Yeah, there's some entries. I think in 2022, when I was keeping the journal, it was oh, we have 5 minutes. Okay, we'll take some questions. Yeah. Just to say briefly, yeah, there's some entries in the journal where I talk about it, and I used to be more involved with like organizing in Chinatown in Toronto around displacement and gentrification, and that of course is happening in Toronto's Chinatown, like in all Chinatowns, and a lot of it is actually driven by the University of Toronto, and like other universities in that area. Which kind of speaks to like the Charles Munger like university shitty student housing model that, yeah, that's like happening a lot in Toronto. And then out of that organizing, I think a model that appeared that was interesting to people was the community land trust model. And so in 2022, we incorporated a Chinatown community land trust. And I think it came about simply because there's so few other models in terms of actually fighting back against the state, you know, like because of the system of private property, which is that as long as you own it, you can do whatever you want and no one else can influence you or have any say. There's so few other ways, kind of options of like fighting back that are effective. And so, you know, the community land trust model is also one that's not necessarily, I think, like the best or has, you know, can be the most successful, because you end up having to raise a lot of money in order to buy land, you know, unless the city gives it to you or whatever. So it's quite complicated in that way too, and I think it can be compromised, and you know, people end up being landlords. They start out as activists and they become landlords. But that is something that's happening in Toronto, and there's a lot of activity in terms of like different land trusts all around the city and in different neighborhoods. Yeah, but yeah, it's kind of like a very, you know, complicated kind of conversation, I think.
Yeah.
Should we take questions from the audience now? Okay, cool. Are there any questions?
I can take a mic over.
Maybe in the meantime, while people think, we can show these photos that are at the end of the slide deck. Which are on the back of the book as well. And these photos are taken from, if you keep going to those photos of these ones. So keep going to the next one, and then to the next one. These are pictures of my parents' house that they sold in Calgary in 2023, and these are pictures directly from the real estate listing. So if you move forward, Mohammed, to the next picture, if you look at the sky, you might notice something about the sky. So go to the next photo. There's something that's happening in these photos, if you keep flipping, with the sky. So keep going. Yeah, it's the same sky. Yeah. So this is the back of the book because the real estate agent, I guess, had replaced the sky in all of these photos with the exact same sky, with the exact same cloud and the exact same position. And I thought it was just an amazing illustration of what this like property is like, you know, this like sinister sameness that's like everywhere. Yeah.
One thing I want to ask you is how did like keeping this journal for an entire year, how did it like change the way that you think about property or real estate or your relationship with it or your relationship with other people?
Yeah, I guess I get asked this question a lot, and to be honest, I feel like it didn't really, it didn't have a, I didn't have like a kind of like epiphany or any kind of like catharsis from keeping it. It was just, by the end, I was like relieved to not be keeping it. Because it made me like constantly think about it, and then I was constantly aware of what people talked about in terms of their own relationships to property, and like other people having more, other people having less. Mostly I was like annoyed when other people had more access or more, you know, and then it was like constant comparison. So yeah, I'm glad to be done. Yeah.
You got a question over here?
Hi, thank you so much, Amy and Audrea, for sharing all this information. I'm really excited to read both of your books. I grew up in Chinatown on the Lower East Side. I cannot afford to live there today. I also work for city planning, and I, deal with land use and zoning issues on a regular basis, go to community board meetings and hear people fight about land and their property, trying to protect their values. And as you probably are aware, the city passed the comprehensive City of Yes for housing affordability to try to open up more opportunities in the creation of affordable housing. And I'm wondering, in your books and in each of your experiences, if you can just share a little bit about some alternative ways of living and relating. Like, I know we always have like single family homes, we have multi-family homes, but what about some alternatives that you might have experienced or observed or documented in your books or in your life about other ways of living in terms of like shared housing, communal housing, accessory dwelling units, ADUs, and other forms of housing that could really help us, maybe move forward in this affordable housing crisis that the city is facing. Thank you so much.
You actually sort of talk about it, I think, more. You actually talk about it more in your book because of your parents moving in with your
my sister.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's an example of like generational housing, but I can't necessarily say that's like going super well. My parents are watching the live stream. I mean, I don't think that I came across that many examples, and I was talking to someone else about this the other day, and we were just saying like how the dominant narrative is so powerful. Like you start out in student housing, you share housing, then you get married, then you have your own house, like the end, and so I can't say that there were that many alternatives, but I feel like in Audrea's book, like, yeah, I guess a lot of your book is also about like people trying to aspire to single family homes and like ownership of that, but in terms of like a worldview, it definitely offers like many different worldviews of how we relate to ownership in general. Like the fact of like being able to own anything, on earth is something that is worth like, yeah, getting rid of. But
yeah, I think we'll definitely like probably the idea in America that's like the idea of intentional communities comes up the most, and that is like sort of tied in, the history of it is like pretty tied in with some of these other like communal land models, like cooperative living, and to some degree, some community land trust, there is like shared housing and stuff like that. But I'm mostly focused on sort of the different ways of structuring ownership or structuring, yeah, like the rights and responsibilities and benefits and whatever. So this sounds very wonky and boring, but the reason that I sort of focus more on this structural part of it is that I think if there's two things. If you can like make land or real estate just way more affordable, and then maybe democratize some of the control over whatever property it is, it actually just opens up all this space for people to figure out how it is that they want to live with each other. Because you have a group, I have several different groups of friends where some of them are here where we're like, oh, we should just grow, we should just retire together because we don't have a plan and we don't have any money and what are we going to do, but we want to have our own space. But the problem, or it's like, oh, we should just like buy a house, like a brownstone together and like, I don't know, split it into like 3 condo units and like we have 3 couples or 3 people or whatever that, and it's just the problem in every case is that just land and real estate is so expensive. So it's just like a total non-starter. I think at this point, there are so many like ways of living together are almost as like numerous as there are like relationships in the world, I can think of people like I would be willing to live with different sets of people in different ways depending on my relationship with them, right? Like, I mean, I would want to like vary if I had to live with several different people, I might want to have different living arrangements with each of them, but it's just the model, the under or overarching like models that we have don't allow space for us to even like imagine other ways of doing that. Yeah, most people can like at most sort of like buy their like 1 or 2 bedroom co-op or something in the city, and not deal with the complication of like applying for a mortgage with your friend, whose like finances are also like not any better than yours. So, yeah.
Yeah, this kind of like dovetails off the last question, but I was really interested in the way in which in both books, property exists in relationship to the family form and to the reproduction of lifeways. And like thinking about like the instance of indigenous communities and like the process of colonization, like destruction of the land, like the cruelty is the point, I guess, like making the land unsustainable for autonomous survival is kind of the point. And I suppose I was just like with what you were saying right now about like pooling together, like some of my parents' friends are talking about this right now because of the state of retirement homes being pretty gnarly. Like the idea of pooling together and like getting a little lot of land and having some tiny homes and then hiring some nurses. But that is a kind of, it's, I think one of the things that's so intimidating about pooling together with friends on, say, a brownstone is this in perpetuity. Like what happens after we die, as opposed to like land that is actually devoted to death, is so much easier under capitalism for people to actually agree to, because there's not going to be the conflict of claims after the fact, like when people have falling outs or whatever. And so I was just kind of, I guess, curious to, yeah, hear a little bit more about like how, like what you saw in terms of, I mean, like, Amy, the family form is so interesting as a backdrop in your story. And like, I'm curious how, if this plays in a bit more. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. It's a good question. I'm thinking through. I don't know. Do you have anything to say on this?
Well, I think, yeah, it's like, it's similar to what I said earlier about like how my parents and my sister are doing. Like it's a very suffocating form in many ways, and it's very isolating too. And I think that that's something that comes through, you know, maybe in my book, and I'm thinking about like North American style living of like single family homes and like people living in these homes, and like seeing my parents' age is like, it's so isolating and it's so lonely, and it really doesn't make any sense. And so there, I think, and yeah, this idea of like death and what happens after death and like how that relates to property is a part of what I was thinking about, and just how it, there's no respect for death, you know, in the system. It's just like there's no room to actually engage with it as like a spiritual or like transcendental part of life, or a very important like key part of life. It just becomes like this thing about money and inheritance, and like where are you gonna put your plot to put your body, you know? And so I think that is, yeah, that's a big part of it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the, I think part of the difficulty with like thinking through what are other ways to do this is that there's actually like a dearth of, it seems like there's a dearth of alternatives. So it's like every time that like if you and I were to decide to do this and like get a place together or figure it out together, it really feels like it is like you and me are just tying ourselves to each other, and it's like we're basically like, should we just get married, call it a day? That's like what it feels like. Whereas in where there are more developed, so like the community land trust model, for instance, I never really like got around to talking about the Boston one, but you know, it's been around for like since the 80s. So decades, it's flourishing, it's established. People can sort of move in and out of this community that is like much more tight knit because of this structure. So right now we have relationships with all of our neighbors. We just don't have, we're like not really necessarily in it together unless we choose to be, you know? We might just end up being enemies with our neighbor. But if you move into like the Dudley Street neighborhood initiatives, like Boston, that Roxbury, community land trust, you move into one of their, you buy into one of their homes, or you rent a home from there, or you just live in the neighborhood and like participate and use their like urban farm or whatever. You're kind of already just entering into kind of sort of a pre-established, I don't know, institution or space, but you have a lot more say in it than if it's just like some nonprofit or a city program or whatever it is, or just some homeowner deciding to open up their backyard to their neighbors or something. So it's like a something in between. And I feel like also this community land trust model has been around for a while. So now I like in the book, I have like spoken to or visited communities where people are sort of taking that model and like adapting it to their own context or needs or their own sort of social structure, their own like cultural needs. Like some of them are you know, like Indigenous led, so like for them it's like very different than just, you know, Bernie Sanders building, like helping to create affordable housing in Burlington or whatever. I think having either like an actually established community project that people can more, you know, the community all stewards together in perpetuity, you know, but people like individuals can move in and out of it. That is like an in-between that allows, you know, for the time that you're part of it, you can, with the other people in your community, you can decide what you want to do with that vacant parcel down the street in a way that like we like don't get to do that in New York City, you know. And it really just like takes the pressure off. Yeah, it's not like we're getting married.
And maybe just like one final thought is like, when we think like today with what happened with the ceasefire in Palestine, it's like, here's an example of being people who are deeply connected to land, and that land is part of struggle, and that is also, that's like very that's a connection that can't be broken, you know, and it's so much tied to resistance and struggle and this idea of having to fight, you know. And yeah, I just want to end on that, and this idea when we talk about land and property and like actually settler colonialism and what's happening now. Yeah, free Palestine.
Thank you, Audrey and Amy, one more time for your brilliant writers. Thank you for sharing your brilliance, thank you for sharing your words. You have one more.
Yeah, we're gonna be selling books in the back, so.
Yeah, support your writers, All right, thank you for joining us. Be on the lookout for more events to come in the winter and the spring. Have a safe trip home, everybody.